Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our series of Major Project Association MPA Sustainability Ambassador webinars. My name is Lucy Hill and I work in AECOM's Climate Change, Sustainability and Resilience team. And I'm AECOM's MPA Sustainability Ambassador. I'll be acting as chair today. This mini-series on electric vehicles follows on from WSP's successful webinars presented late last year. Our previous sustainability webinars are available on the MPA Knowledge Community YouTube channel, so please do check out those previous WSP webinars there. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a couple of things. For your information, we are muted and cameras are disabled, so if you want to chat to us, please use the chat function. And we should have plenty of time at the end, so please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. Throughout the webinar, we will also be running a few polls to get your views on various things. The first one is ready for you to answer in the chat function. You should be able to see the polls, which you can answer now. And the question is, what type of vehicle do you own? So please do go ahead and answer that first poll, and Luke will discuss the answers to that question in the first part of the webinar. I'd also like to let you know that our next webinar in this series is a week today. Transition to EVs, the hidden social and environmental impacts, and you can sign up to that at projects.org/events. So our presenter today, Luke Aldred, has worked in AECOM's Sustainable Development Group for nearly 7 years, providing a range of sustainability-focused services associated with renewable energy, low carbon development, decarbonisation strategies, future fuels and energy trends. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Luke for his presentation on electric vehicles transition to the future. Thank you.
And I think I'm live. So thank you, Lucy, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone who has joined us today. My name is Luke Aldred. I work for AECOM and in the sustainability energy transition field. And generally an environmental campaigner and interested partner. So as Lucy just mentioned, this is the first of 2 webinars on the subject. So our colleague Sally Vivian will be taking up the baton next week, a week today, where we'll discuss it more, the sort of socio-environmental impact of this transition. There is a chat function, so please do note down any comments that you've got going through or any questions, and Lucy as chair will try and collate those questions as we move through the session. Let's move on. So as Lucy mentioned, there's a poll that's published and out now on the chat function. What type of vehicle do you own? So we've got the full spectrum of answers there. I'm just looking at the results coming in now. Crikey, we've got over 100 votes already on that question. Most people, roughly half, just over half, 52%, own petrol or diesel vehicles, but they are thinking of changing to electric soon. There's a sort of 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of us are reticent to change to electric vehicles by the looks of it. About 1 in 5 don't own a vehicle, which was my situation until fairly recently. So there's a lot of people that don't own vehicles, and there's the occasional electric vehicle owner amongst us. So please do keep those votes coming in, and there'll be some more questions as we go through, or more polls as we go through the session at various points. So to keep you on your toes and to sort of gauge that interest of where we are, I suppose. So in terms of what I suggest we talk about today, or what I'll talk to you about today, a series of questions, I suppose. So what's going on? What's all this noise about? There's a lot of noise in the media about electric vehicles, whether that is government policy, whether it's the banning of new petrol and diesel vehicles in a few years' time, whether it's the major car manufacturers are pumping out new models onto the market. There's a real sort of buzz around this subject and a real level of interest shown and a lot of noise. But I suppose the question also then is, why is this noise out there? Why is this happening? So I'll talk about that. Then I'll go into sort of what is happening and when, and then how will this change our lives? So how is it going to happen? How will this transition be facilitated? How will it change our built environment? How will it change our behaviors? So I've tried to structure this around a series of questions posed to myself that hopefully I will be able to answer or provide some degree of shed some light on it. So my aim for today is not really to dive deep into into this subject on a technical basis. It's really to provide that sort of umbrella, that helicopter view, an introduction to this subject. Why is this taking place, and hopefully provides an answer to those questions on the screen there at the moment. So what's all this noise about? So as I said, there's you can barely move for headlines in the newspapers around the banning of petrol or diesel vehicles. There's headlines around all the major car manufacturers. They're racing to put out new models onto the market. There's things like the Braintree up in the top right there. We see the sort of start of a new infrastructure for charging vehicles. This is a major new EV charge hub, effectively, almost like a service station for electric cars. That opened in Essex recently, last year. And how can we not talk about Tesla? Tesla, remarkable company, even though it sells less than 1 million units a year. It depends on who you read, but or what sources you read. But it is by a country mile the most valuable car manufacturer on the planet. Some sources suggest that it's worth more than the next 7 car manufacturers, which is a remarkable statistic in terms of market capitalization, in terms of company value. It's worth more than Toyota, VW, Daimler, General Motors, BMW, Honda, and Ford all put together, which is crazy. There's undoubtedly probably an element of financial market sort of bubble thing going on there, but nevertheless, it is indicative. It's an indicative statistic which sort of shouts the fact that there is a lot of noise. There's something going on here. So why is this happening? So why is all that noise out there? One is, I've summed it up in one word called Dieselgate. So if you cast your mind back 2 or 3 years, there was a major controversy amongst some of the big car manufacturers to do with the cheating of emissions testing, effectively. And these were not emissions like carbon emissions or climate changing emissions. These were pollutants that cause great amounts of health impacts. And this picture, I think, sums it all up, really. The emissions that come out of the tailpipe of a vehicle are not noxious. They are poisonous. That you've got particulate emissions, which are really tiny microscopic particles that get into your lungs. They cause incredible irritability. They cause health impacts. You've got carbon monoxide, CO. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer, very noxious, very poisonous gases. NOx emissions, which are nitrogen oxide compounds, highly irritable, cause a great deal of damage to lungs and respiratory systems. You've got unburnt hydrocarbons floating around the atmosphere that are emitted from the tailpipe of vehicles. Each and every year, the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, estimates that air pollution results in 40,000 excess deaths a year in the UK alone, and increases and places a burden of financial burden on the health and social system of roughly £20 billion every year. So if we think 40,000 sounds like a big number, and it is a huge number. If we think about the number of deaths from COVID-19 last year in 2020, in the UK, COVID, the single greatest health catastrophe of our lifetime, claimed roughly 80,000 lives in the UK. So what we're seeing here is air pollution is basically having roughly half the impact of COVID-19 every single year, which is a crazy statistic, really. And it shows the impact that air pollution can have, and road transport is a major contributor to that pollution and that health crisis. The other one, we can't get away from this. This is climate, and if we think COVID was a disaster, climate change is going to be a disaster on a different scale. It will accelerate, and it's something that does not just impact humans; it impacts the entire planet. So we've all seen that hockey stick graph in the bottom left. On the left-hand side, by definition, that's an unsustainable situation that cannot go on forever. And actually, the UK in the last sort of 30 years has actually brought our emissions down quite a lot. So international climate agreements are benchmarked against 1990 as a base year, and roughly since 1990, in the 30 years since then, we've roughly halved our emissions, our global warming emissions, since that date. So the coloured bars that we can see there, we can see that actually some of the major contributors, some of the major sector contributors to those emissions have come down quite significantly. So manufacturing, that's roughly halved, you would say. Electricity and heat has come down a lot as well, especially in recent years. Waste used to be a fairly significant source of emissions. That's come down to almost, it's a side player now. Transport, though, is almost the one sector which has booked that downward trend. And if anything, actually, it's increased since 1990. Maybe the last year, 2020, that's different because no one was driving around much in 2020. But nevertheless, it's a very stubbornly high contributor to emissions. But the pathway to decarbonize that sector is clear. We have a path, we have a technology, we have options to bring those emissions down. And that's broadly speaking because we have an electricity grid. Our electrical grid in the UK has halved in the space of a decade. The carbon content on that grid has halved. So for decades, we used to have a fossil-led electricity network, so coal-fired power stations. A bit of nuclear came on in the 60s and 70s. We had the dash for gas in the 90s, so a downward trend, but really still very fossil-based. And it took roughly 50 years to halve the amount of carbon emissions on the electricity network. It took 50 years to halve that from 1960 through to about 2010. Since 2010, it's halved again. So the pace of change, the pace of that decarbonisation has accelerated, and that has created a situation where now this is a game changer and can facilitate the decarbonisation of transportation if we electrify it. So roughly, as a comparator, if we compare against gasoline-fueled vehicles, an electric vehicle now in 2020, or last year in 2020, produces roughly half the amount of global warming emissions, CO2 emissions, as gasoline vehicles. And that will only continue that downward trend. By 2035, we estimate somewhere in the region of 90% reduction of emissions due to that transition from gasoline to electric vehicles. And that is brought about by the continued decarbonisation of the electricity network as more and more fossil sources of power drop off the grid, and that slack is taken up by renewable sources of energy. But why now? So the technological side of it allows us to do that now. We're in that position where the technology can do that for us, but we're also under treaty obligations. The Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, the single greatest concentration of delegates and agreements around the world to limit our impact on the climate, produced some very ambitious targets for limiting the effect of global warming. But those are current treaty obligations. We're also very likely to come up with or come up against future treaty obligations at the end of this year. So the successor to Paris is in Glasgow later this year, COP26. UK is the host of that, with it being in Glasgow, and the UK therefore has to show incredible leadership and ambition to match that. The world will be looking at the UK and expecting the UK to lead by example and to put its money where its mouth is. So we have ever increasing treaty obligations in this space as well. I think it's time for another poll. So what would be the most important factor? Lucy, I don't know if you want to publish it. I think you've just published it. Brilliant. Question 2, what would be the most important positive factor in your decision to buy an electric vehicle? Is it regarding the making a positive contribution to climate change? Is it making a positive contribution to air quality, the cost of operation? So there are incentives to encourage the uptake. Is there another reason? Or would you never buy an electric vehicle? So please do have a vote now. I'll return to the results a bit later. In the meantime, we'll have a look at what is happening. So countries around the planet are banning new petrol and diesel vehicles. So that map actually, I think, is already out of date. The pace of change in this space is such that these announcements come thick and fast, and not just one announcement. As we can see there, the UK has sort of shifted its position. Less than 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, was the first policy announcement to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles by 2040. So that was the headline back in July 2017. By February 2020, which is only a year ago, that had been brought forward to 2035, and before the year was even out last year, that was brought forward even further to 2030. So in less than a decade, it will not be possible to buy new petrol or diesel cars in the UK. But that's aligning with a whole host of other countries. So we can see the Nordics and the Netherlands and India right at the front of this agenda as well. Japan, large parts of the world are now on this path to phasing out and banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's a rapid increase now in electric vehicle sales. This is the stock of vehicles, this slide. So there's roughly 33 million registered cars in the UK. There's roughly 40 million vehicles in total. Electric vehicles, either plug-in hybrid or plug-in only. So hybrid vehicles have both battery and gasoline engines, but plug-in hybrid and plug-in battery only account for roughly 1%. It's not a very big number, 1%, but 1% of all currently registered cars. That's the stock of cars. Now, the market share for new vehicles, so newly bought vehicles, however, is much higher. So EV share of new vehicle market in 2019 in some countries was extraordinary. So more than half of the new vehicles in Norway were electric in 2019. As ever, the Nordics and the Netherlands and places like that are running away with this. There's a big shift going on in that space, but the UK is halfway down that list. What is that? About 3%, 2.5%, 3%. That was the market share for new vehicles in 2019. Of course, 2019 is pre-COVID, and actually, what we were seeing in 2020, the preliminary data for 2020 suggests that was increasing significantly. By the end of the year, in December, almost a quarter of all new vehicles were electric. So this pace is quickening, and of course we've got new vehicles or new models coming on the market all the time, which is helping consumers with their choice, and it's helping provide that confidence for that the market is maturing into this area. So lots of stuff happening. We've got one more poll. So Lucy, if you can publish that. What is your biggest concern when thinking about an electric vehicle? Is it running out of range or fuel? Is it the logistics of charging it at home? Is it the price of the vehicle? Is it the limited choice of models? Hopefully that is, the manufacturers are responding to that. Is there a safety concern? Is it that it's just too new? This is a market that is not mature, a technology that is not mature. Is there another reason, or don't you have any concerns at all? So please do vote. We'll come back to the results at the end of the Q&A. But how is this going? What's the effect going to be? So how is this going to happen? The transition. How will it change our built environment? How will this change our behaviors? That's an interesting subject. I'll touch on that. And how easy will this transition be? So how is this going to happen? Broadly speaking, there needs to be underlying infrastructure to facilitate this transition. And this will require charge points. This will require charge points almost everywhere we look. So the RAC describe a public charge point network, which is made up of charging facilities of different speeds, of different scales, in different parts of the country for different types of interfacing, and I'll come back to that in a moment. There's roughly 37,000 charge facilities or charge points today. That needs to expand by more than tenfold, we think, by the end of the decade. So according to the Policy Exchange, which is a think tank in the UK, they released a report earlier this week, actually, just a few days ago, that suggested that the number of charge points needs to be 400,000 by the end of the decade. A huge number. As I said, there's roughly 37,000 charge connectors today. Those are in approximately 13,500 locations So you can imagine that there are a number of connectors within the same location. And this graph here sort of shows that increase. But what that means really, in less than a decade, we need to expand our charge network in the UK by roughly 35,000 connectors every year. There's 37,000 currently in the country. So that the pace of the rollout for that is going to need to be expanded significantly. There are different types of charge points. So we see the different colors of that graph: slow, fast, rapid, and ultra rapid. I think if there is an even faster one than ultra rapid, then I don't know what they'll call that, but there'll be maybe warp speed. But these are describing the rate at which charge is dispensed into the vehicle. So the slow chargers, the type that you might find in domestic settings, they charge at just a few kilowatts. It would take roughly 12 or more hours to refill from empty to full. So for public charging, that's perhaps a little too slow. So the market has shifted towards the much faster, rapid, ultra rapid facilities in recent years, and I think that's probably where we'll see the most growth, certainly for the public charging facilities over the next few years. But it's worth maybe just pausing on that for a moment. So we said there were 400,000 facilities or 400,000 connectors that we think will be needed across the country over the next decade. But we don't have hundreds of thousands of gas stations. In 2019, this box on the right-hand side, in 2019, there were 8,385 gas stations in the UK. So we don't have millions or hundreds of thousands of gas stations. And why is that? And the answer to this, in some ways, will also shed some light on the changing behavior and how we will need to change how we interface with this infrastructure. So refilling, if you think about refilling our petrol and diesel vehicles, it takes only a few minutes, right? So we drive up to the forecourt, get out, 2 or 3 minutes at the pump. That 2 or 3 minutes provides hundreds of miles of fuel, or hundreds of miles worth of fuel. So you can drive from the south coast of England to Scotland and back, probably on one tank of fuel in a sensible journey and an efficient car. So the range acquired for the time taken to fill up is very, very high, and the reason for that is partly to do with the energy density, as we call it. So gasoline can be pumped under pressure. The amount of energy stored within that small volume of gasoline is extraordinary. But that gasoline also needs to be stored safely. It also needs to be delivered to site frequently. These characteristics have led to a highly centralized network for traditional petroleum-based filling stations. It's a highly centralized network. The opposite will be true for electric vehicles. We'll see a very decentralized infrastructure network where we'll have charge points on the street. We'll have them at shopping malls, in parking lots, workplaces, supermarkets, sports grounds, transport nodes. They'll be almost everywhere. They'll be ubiquitous around our built environment. And what that will do will allow us to engage with the infrastructure in a different way to what we do with gasoline. So, and this will help to answer the sort of fear question of where's my next charge going to come from, this concept of range anxiety. So what we're likely to see are two types of charging. We're likely to see journey charging and grazing charging. So journey charging is where we go to a destination for the sole purpose of charging the vehicle. So that might be comparable with with the gas station, the petrol station type interface. However, it will still take maybe 20-30 minutes to get a decent amount of charge in a vehicle, even at an ultra fast, ultra rapid charge point. There'll also be grazing charging, where perhaps what we're doing is we're going to a destination for a different purpose, but while we are there, we will plug in and charge and just do a little top up, whether that's from 40% to 50% or from 60% to 75% charge. It's just that little top up while we're there. We'll take the opportunity to get a little extra juice. And that might be, when we go to the supermarket, we're there for an hour maybe. Let's plug in. There will be chargers maybe at the Tesco's and the Sainsbury's in the future, and we can plug in and just get that extra 5, 10, 15% while we're inside. Restaurants, again, you might imagine that. So the way that we interface and our behaviours around charging and refilling will change. When we speak to people who own electric vehicles, on the whole, my experience is that they say that they aren't anxious about range. What they are is aware of range. They have range awareness rather than range anxiety, and they will be much more aware of how much charge they've got, how much they need for a certain journey, how much they can get at a certain charge facility. So it's about the psychology of not the psychology of driving, but the psychology of charging or refilling our vehicles will change over time as we move into this transition. So, and then finally, I just wanted to touch on, so how easy will this transition be? Well, for over a century now, we've been using gasoline, petroleum-based products to power our transportation, and what we've just described there now is a transition to electric-based transportation. That is going to place an enormous extra burden on electricity supplies, on the localized electricity demand will also peak, and there will need to be enormous infrastructure investment to upscale and to facilitate this change. So expect a lot of infrastructure spending on electricity supplies over the next 10 years. The other side of it is materials. So, and this will be picked up in greater depth by my colleague next week, Sally. She'll be talking about the socioeconomic impacts of transitioning into this new technology. Materials will need to be mined on a scale that different materials will need to be mined. Okay, we won't need to maybe mine as much oil and gasoline anymore, but new resources will have to be found, extracted, and that will have to be done in a responsible way to avoid problems arising from this new story. So tune in next week to hear that subject picked up in greater depth by Sally. But I think that's all I really had for you to present to you today. But we can have a look at the polls and take any Q&A. So let's return back to question 1. So what type of vehicle do you own? So we had 162 votes. That's a good poll, that is. So 53% said option C, petrol or diesel, but thinking of changing to electric soon. So roughly half own, I suppose it's unsurprising, own a petrol diesel car, but they are thinking of changing to electric soon. 18%, almost 1 in 5, own petrol or diesel but don't want to change to electric, It'll be interesting to see what the reasons are for that. I guess 1%, interestingly, 1% has gone for LPG. 19% say they don't own a vehicle. And then we've got 4% own a full electric vehicle and 6% the hybrid version. So that was question 1. Question 2. Let me see the results. Hang on. What was the most important factor, positive factor, in your decision to buy an electric vehicle? Option A, making a positive contribution to climate change. That was 51%. Option B, interesting. So making a positive contribution to air quality had 10% of votes. And then almost a third mentioned cost of ownership or cost of operation. And then another reason attracted 7%. But actually nobody voted for I wouldn't buy an electric vehicle, so that's a good one. So that was question 2. And then question 3, we had what's the biggest concern when thinking about an electric vehicle? 27% said running out of fuel or range. So that is probably the one worry that I hear often. Hopefully what I presented today has sort of painted a picture that well, twofold. It will hopefully painted a picture that the infrastructure is coming, and that, you know, that will hopefully put to rest sort of the concerns around range or ownership or fuel rather. The logistics of charging it at home attracted 20%. So I recognize that concern. So I live in a 2-bedroom flat. I don't have my own driveway. I have a car, but it's parked about 100 meters away on the street. There's no charging facility on the street. So there is, particularly for those who don't have sort of their own parking spot or their own driveway or garage, I can see that this is a major concern for people in that position. So so charging at home attracted 1 in 5. The price of the vehicle got 38% of the vote. The price of the vehicle, I think what we're going to see in the next few years is that the purchase price of vehicles will come down and will probably align more with the conventional vehicles. So we'll probably see that come down. And then the other answers, so limited choice of models, 2%, safety 3%. It's too new. It's an immature technology, got 4%, and then some others. So so those were the polls. Lucy, I don't know if there was any Q&A, any particular questions that kept coming up in the chat.
We had a few questions. I must say that if we can't answer all the questions, we will try and answer those at a later date. We had one question about whether there's a difference in carbon emissions when manufacturing EVs versus petrol cars. And I think Sally has actually answered that in the chat function.
Okay.
So, and also that will possibly be covered next week on the webinar about the environmental and social impacts. So do tune in for that one. One of the general questions was, will the grid actually be able to cope? The demand will be unpredictable, and if we are expanding capacity, how will we know how much to expand by?
Yeah, that's a really important. I'm just going to go back to this slide here, which sort of points to that problem, doesn't it? the scale of demand on the grid is going to be huge. It's going to expand significantly, and it will expand at a macro level. So what I mean by that is at a nationwide level, the demand for power will increase significantly. But it will also expand, and this is in some ways even more challenging to address. It will also expand very locally as well. So what we'll see is if our local supermarket installs 20 or 30 charge points, and each of those are quick enough to deliver a significant amount of juice while customers are in the store for an hour. What that does is, in a very localized way, it produces quite a spike in the local demand for power. Now, upstream of that spike, on the local grid infrastructure, the cabling, the substations that serve that local area, perhaps they become overloaded. They are insufficient for this new demand, and so there will need to be very localized, not just at the macro level, capacity upgrades. So you can think at a macro level, okay, let's install new power generators, expansion of wind farms in the North Sea, expansion of power stations across the country. That's at the macro level. But we're also going to see very localized upgrades of electricity infrastructure, the cabling, the substations that serve those local areas. So you're right to highlight that the electricity grid is going to be there's a concern around whether that grid can adapt and meet this anticipated expansion in demand, and we're likely to see very extensive investment in this infrastructure in the next few years.
Thanks for that, Luke. Next question is, how is EV going to be able to offer a viable solution to lower income / businesses reliant on their vehicles? The immediate growth is expected to be, as the numbers are surely indicative of those most capable of transitioning to EV.
Yeah, so there is it's a very valid question, and I suppose what this is still is maybe just maturing, but it is a disruptor sort of trend, or disruptor technology, and I suppose disruptors often are quite expensive to begin with, and it's only when that market matures and we get scale and the maturity in the supply chains and the market that we see prices sort of come down to comparable prices with conventional vehicles. But you're right, in a sense, what this is sort of the concept of communities or certain communities maybe being left behind in this transition. That is going to need a lot of attention by ministers and by policymakers to make sure that does not happen. Transport is not just a luxury; it is a necessity for large parts of our society, and it would be intolerable to leave certain parts of society behind as we transition to this new future, especially when that new future effectively outlaws or bans the current or the past. So there is a very real need for policymakers to enable this transition, to enable everybody to benefit from this transition. That is an important subject. There are some grant schemes and financial support or incentives to assist with this transition, but that needs to be sustained over the long term, and it needs to reach all parts of society, not least the lower income bands that you mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have another question about what extent should the transition be beyond vehicle ownership, e.g. shared car ownership or car demand services?
So that's a good one. It's almost a different subject entirely in a way, but the sharing economy is something that has grown up a lot in the last few years, and the car club or the carpooling, these are all trends that we're seeing, and should, that what they do is make better use of assets, right? So we've got, if my car might be stood still for 2 or 3 weeks, and then I get in the car and drive somewhere. So in a sharing economy, in this sort of pooling economy that you described, it's almost transport as a service, or sort of, instead of owning cars, you sort of lease, you rent them for a short period through an ownership model, a carpooling model. So quite how electric vehicles feed into that, I think naturally they will need to, but yes, this is a trend. I support this trend. There's a place for sort of policymakers and town planners as well, and local authorities to encourage that through development. So yeah.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question before we close the session. So what is your view on the future uptake of EV versus fuel cell technology?
Okay, that's a really interesting one. So fuel cell, just to shed some light on that, fuel cell technology makes use of hydrogen as a fuel. So hydrogen fueled transport is another big topic at the moment. It's my view on that. There are different views around the industry on this. My view on this is that hydrogen and fuel cells are likely to play a role in the future transition of transportation, but it will probably be a more niche role. So it will probably be the reserve of freight vehicles, of heavy good vehicles, and the larger end of the spectrum, maybe buses, maybe trains as well. So there are examples of trains now in places like Germany and also in the UK. Very recently, have just trialed the first hydrogen fuel cell train. So there are, there is impetus there, but I think it will be the reserve of those niches. I think the electric vehicle market will grab the lion's share of smaller vehicles, sort of personal transportation vehicles like cars. So that's my view. There are competing views, and different people will tell you different things. But my personal view is that electric vehicles will take that lion's share of personal transport, and hydrogen fuel cell market will take the sort of larger niche parts of the market.
That's great. So as I said earlier, we'll try and answer some of the questions at a later date. But basically, thank you very much, Luke, for presenting today. It's been really good. I've definitely learned a lot. Just to say that the webinar will be available on YouTube at a later date. And also just a quick reminder that our next webinar will be the same time next week. Sally Vivian will be presenting on transitioning to EVs, the hidden social and environmental impacts, and you can sign up at majorprojects.org/events. So I'll just quickly hand over to Andy, who is going to provide some information about some other future MPA events. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lucy, and thank you very much, Luke, too, and for your AECOM colleagues in putting this on. I've noticed there's been quite a few of you answering some of the questions in the chat too. Yeah, great thoughts for us of project professionals, engineers, and so on in the major projects world of the impacts coming downstream. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more on that from Sally next week. I did pin the link in the chat as well, so if you haven't registered for it, please do so. And in terms of events coming up, so our next seminar is a half-day seminar in a couple of weeks' time, and it's on productivity, and that's going to be chaired by Program Director of the Type 26 program from BAE Systems. So we've got lots of different speakers contributing to that. Details of that can be found on our website. And after that, we've got a Cube at Work. For any of you who have not participated in one of our Cube at Work sessions, they're like an evening social. It's a sort of Second Life environment where you appear as an avatar in an environment, and it's a way of networking and going to talk to others in and around the same sort of Second Life environment. And that's going to be talking about planning in an uncertain world. So been lots of useful discussions. So if that's of interest, please do go along to that one as well. And then after that, we've got another seminar coming up in March, which is around benchmarking, and that's reimagining benchmarking, taking a look at different approaches that's now available to us to understand, how projects ought to perform and how projects ought to cost, and in particular learning from different sectors. So we've got a number of speakers lined up for that one, providing sort of sectoral views on how they benchmark their projects, and that's going to be chaired by Ed Marrow, the CEO of the International Projects Analysts, IPA. So that's what's coming up. Please do look at our website and see the details and register for those. Lastly, thank you very much once again to Lucy, Luke, and the team.